The first sign was a credit card bill I never opened because I never applied for the card. It arrived on a Tuesday in a white envelope with my name printed cleanly on the front, my full legal name, my address. A balance of $4,217 for a card I had never held in my hands. I stood in my apartment hallway holding it for a full minute before I understood what I was looking at. I was 24 years old. I had been careful with money my entire adult life because I had learned early that no one was going to be careful with it for me. I had a budget. I tracked my spending in a notebook every week. I checked my bank account more than most people checked their phone. I did not have a credit card from that company. I did not have a credit card from any company, actually, because I was still building credit slowly and intentionally and had not yet applied for one. The name on the bill was mine. The Social Security number printed partially on the inside paperwork was mine. The address listed as the statement address was not mine. It was an apartment across the city. I knew whose apartment it was before I finished reading. My sister's name is Renata. She is 3 years older than me and has been a specific kind of problem since we were children, the kind that escalates gradually over years until suddenly you are standing in a hallway holding $4,000 of debt you did not create and understanding that the escalation has reached a new level entirely. Growing up, Renata lied about small things. Who ate the last of something? Whether she had finished her homework. Where she had been on nights when our mother asked. The lies were unremarkable individually. Together they formed a pattern that our parents called a phase and I called a personality. She borrowed money and didn't return it. Jewelry went missing from our mother's dresser and turned up at a pawn shop 2 towns over. Our father gave her money for a car and the car appeared for 3 weeks and then disappeared along with the money's explanation. Our parents called these things mistakes. They were more patient with Renata than I thought the situation deserved. I left home at 18 for a university 4 hours away, and the distance was deliberate. I loved my family. I needed space from the particular chaos that followed Renata everywhere she went. I studied accounting. I graduated in 3.5 years by taking extra classes and summer sessions. I got a job at a mid-sized firm in the city where I'd gone to school and stayed there because the work was steady and the people were reasonable and I was building something careful and solid. I shared an apartment with a coworker named Felicity for the first year, then got my own place when I could afford it. Small, clean, quiet. Mine. Renata and I talked occasionally. Holidays, sometimes birthdays. The calls were warm enough on the surface and I genuinely cared about her underneath all the frustration. But I'd learned to keep the relationship at a certain distance because closeness with Renata had a consistent cost and I had paid it enough times to understand the pattern. I called her the evening I found the credit card bill. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was light and easy, the way it always was when she didn't yet know that a specific thing had been discovered. I asked her to explain the credit card bill. The lightness in her voice shifted into something more careful. She said she didn't know what I was talking about. I read her the account number. She went quiet. I told her to tell me the truth because I already knew enough that lying was going to make everything worse for both of us. What came out over the next 30 minutes was a partial truth shaped to minimize her role and maximize circumstance. She said she had borrowed my information just to apply for the card because her credit was too damaged to get approved on her own. She said she had planned to pay it off before I ever found out. She said the balance got higher than she expected because of some emergencies I didn't fully understand. She said she was sorry and that she would pay it back. I asked if there were other accounts. She said no. She was lying. Over the following 2 weeks, I pulled my full credit report for the first time and discovered what Renata had actually done. There were 4 accounts total. The credit card I had already found. A personal loan for $8,000 opened 18 months earlier. A store credit account with a balance of just over $2,000. And a second credit card with a different bank balance of $6,000 that was already 3 months past due and heading toward collections. The total was just over $20,000. $20,000 of debt in my name, accumulated over nearly 2 years, charged to my social security number without my knowledge or consent while I was 4 hours away building a careful and quiet life in my small clean apartment. My credit score had been decent. I'd protected it specifically because I knew I would need it eventually. A mortgage someday, a car loan, the ordinary financial infrastructure of a normal adult life. My credit score was now destroyed, not damaged. Destroyed. The kind of number that closed doors before conversation started. I sat with my credit report on my kitchen table for a long time. The numbers were very clear. The accounts were very real. The name on all of them was mine. I thought about Renata's voice going quiet when I read her the account number. I thought about all the small lies from childhood. I thought about the jewelry and the car and the money and the phases that never quite ended. Then I thought about what came next, because something had to come next. I just needed to decide what it was going to be. I called a lawyer before I called my parents. Her name was Constance Obi, and she specialized in financial fraud and identity theft cases. A colleague at my firm had used her 2 years earlier for a different situation and said she was direct and didn't waste time. Constance was both of those things. I sent her the credit report and the account documentation, and she called me back within a day. She explained my options clearly. I could file a police report, dispute all 4 accounts with the credit bureaus, and pursue civil action against Renata for the damages. She said the evidence was clear enough that the disputes would likely succeed, but the timeline was going to be long and the process was going to require consistent attention from me for months. She asked if I wanted to pursue criminal charges against my sister. I said I needed time to think about that part. She said that was fair but told me I didn't have unlimited time. The longer the accounts sat without dispute, the more complicated the resolution became. She told me to start the dispute process regardless of what I decided about the criminal piece because the two things could move separately. I started the dispute process that week. Constance handled the formal filings and I provided documentation. It required more paperwork than I expected and more follow-up calls than seemed reasonable and more patience than I had easy access to at the time. Every call with a credit bureau or a collections department required me to explain the situation again from the beginning to a different person who treated skepticism as their default setting. I told my parents on a Saturday afternoon. I drove home specifically to do it in person because I wanted to see their faces when they understood what had actually happened. My mother's name is Gloria. My father's name is Desmond. They were both home when I arrived. I laid the credit report on the kitchen table and walked them through each account one by one. I gave them dates and balances and the address that Renata had used on the applications, which was her own apartment, the one across the city, the one I had immediately recognized. My mother started crying before I finished. My father sat very still. Neither of them seemed surprised in the way that people seem surprised when something is genuinely new information. They seemed surprised in the way people seem surprised when something they quietly feared is finally confirmed out loud. I asked if they had known anything. My father said he hadn't known the details, but had lent Renata money several times in the past 2 years when she said she was in financial trouble. He'd assumed she was living beyond her means in the ordinary way. He hadn't imagined this. My mother said Renata had asked her, about a year ago, if she could borrow some identifying documents for a rental application. My mother said she had declined, and they'd argued about it, and she had assumed the matter was finished. She hadn't connected that conversation to what was sitting on the kitchen table now. I didn't say what I was thinking. I sat with them for 2 hours while they processed and asked questions, and my mother cried again, and my father made calls to Renata that she didn't answer. I drove home that evening and went to bed early because the emotional weight of the day required the kind of rest that sleep could only partially provide. Renata called me the next morning. My mother had reached her the night before. She was sorry. She was going to fix it. She would call the creditors herself and explain. She had a plan. The plan changed slightly every few sentences in a way that suggested it wasn't actually a plan, but a series of reassurances she was constructing in real time. I listened without interrupting. Then I told her that Constance was already handling the disputes formally and that Renata calling the creditors herself would complicate the process. I told her Constance would be in touch about what cooperation she needed from Renata in terms of documentation. I told her clearly that the accounts were going to be disputed and removed from my credit report and that she was going to need to face the consequences of her own decisions. She asked if I was pressing charges. I told her I hadn't decided yet. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she hoped I understood that she had been in a desperate situation and hadn't intended to hurt me. She said she had always planned to pay it back before I found out. I told her I noticed that the goal had been for me not to find out rather than to not do it. She didn't have a response to that. The disputes took 8 months total. Constance was thorough and persistent, and the evidence I provided was documented enough that all 4 accounts were eventually removed from my credit report. The process required me to submit affidavits and follow up with each bureau individually and respond to requests for additional documentation on timelines that didn't account for the fact that I had a full-time job. My credit score came back. Not all the way, not immediately, but enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to see the possibility of the things I'd been building toward on the other side. The firm I worked for knew something had happened because I had asked my manager, a precise woman named Yolanda, for flexibility on 2 Friday afternoons to handle calls with the credit bureaus. Yolanda asked if I was okay, and I told her the short version. She listened without commentary and said the flexibility wasn't a problem and to let her know if I needed anything else. That kind of response from a manager meant more than she probably knew. I did not file criminal charges against Renata. I made that decision quietly and kept it to myself. Not because what she did was acceptable, not because she deserved protection from consequences, but because my parents would be caught in the middle of something they couldn't fix, and because Renata facing a criminal charge at that moment felt like a door I could always open later and couldn't close once it was open. I cut contact instead, completely and without announcement. I stopped answering her calls. I didn't respond to her messages. I wasn't hostile. I was simply absent. I redirected my energy toward rebuilding what she had damaged and building further beyond it. She had taken $20,000 of liability and 8 months of my time and significant damage to something I had constructed carefully. I was going to build something she couldn't touch. The year after the disputes resolved was the most productive year of my professional life. I focused the energy I'd been using to manage the fallout of Renata's actions and redirected it entirely into my work. There was a particular clarity that came from having spent a year cleaning up a mess I didn't create. It made ordinary professional challenges feel manageable by comparison. Problems at work had solutions. Problems with credit bureaus had solutions too, but they were slower and more arbitrary and had nothing to do with how well you did your job. Going back to a world where effort produced proportional results felt almost luxurious. Yolanda noticed the shift in my output and mentioned it in my performance review. She said I had always been thorough, but that year I had become indispensable to the team in a way that went beyond thoroughness. She recommended me for a senior analyst position that came open when a colleague moved to another city. I got the promotion and the raise that came with it and immediately put the additional income toward the financial goals I had delayed during the dispute year. And my colleague Felicity, who I had lived with in my first year in the city and stayed close to since, celebrated the promotion with me over dinner at a restaurant we both liked but usually considered too expensive for a regular Tuesday. She ordered dessert and told me I was one of the most resilient people she knew. I told her I wasn't sure resilience was the right word. She asked what word I would use instead. I said stubborn. She laughed and said those were probably the same thing most of the time. I started working with a financial planner named Arthur, who Yolanda had mentioned, when I told her I was trying to accelerate my financial recovery. Arthur was methodical and thorough and had the particular quality of explaining complex things without making you feel stupid for not already knowing them. He reviewed my situation and built a plan that accounted for where I was starting from and where I was trying to go. He said I was behind where I should be for my age because of what had happened, but that behind was not the same as out of reach. He used that phrase several times over the course of our work together. Behind is not the same as out of reach. I wrote it in my notebook the first time he said it. My relationship with my parents was steady and warm through all of this, which I was grateful for. They had handled the situation with Renata the way my parents handled most difficult things, with care and imperfect communication and a persistent belief that families were supposed to stay together regardless of what that cost individual members. I understood their position even when I didn't share it. I never asked them to choose between me and Renata. I just asked them not to tell Renata things about my life, and they respected that. My mother occasionally mentioned Renata in passing. Small updates delivered carefully, like she was checking whether the subject was allowable. Renata had moved to a different apartment. Renata had a new job. Renata was doing better. I listened to these updates without responding to them directly. I didn't want the information, but I understood my mother needed to offer it. My father never brought her up. He and I talked about other things. His work, which was winding down toward retirement. My work, which he didn't fully understand but found genuinely impressive. The garden he'd started growing in the backyard. Those conversations were easy and I valued them. Felicity got married when I was 27 and I was in her wedding and spent the reception dancing more than I had in years. Her husband's name was Garrett and he was calm and funny and made her laugh in a way that was visible from across a room. I liked him immediately and told her so, which she said she already knew because she'd asked my opinion before saying yes, and I had given it honestly. That was the kind of friendship worth keeping. The kind where honesty was the baseline and everything else built on top of it. I bought a car at 27. A reliable, practical car that I paid a reasonable price for and researched for 3 weeks before committing to. Arthur had advised me to wait until my credit score was in a specific range before applying for the loan. I waited. I hit the number. I applied and got a rate that was reasonable and not punishing. Driving that car home from the dealership, I thought about the personal loan Renata had taken in my name. $8,000. I thought about whoever at that loan company had approved that application. I thought about how easy it apparently was to borrow money in someone else's name if you had their information and a convincing story. I thought about how I had spent a year undoing something she had done in probably a few hours. I turned the radio on and drove home. At 28, Arthur told me I was ahead of the adjusted timeline we had set. I asked what ahead meant specifically, and he gave me numbers that represented actual progress in concrete terms. The savings account, the retirement contributions, the credit score, now fully recovered and climbing, the position I was building toward. He said given where I had started 2 years ago, the progress was exceptional. I thought about that word. Exceptional. I had been exceptional at managing a catastrophe someone else created. I was going to be exceptional at building something that catastrophe couldn't reach. I kept working. I kept saving. I kept showing up every day and doing things right and building carefully. And then, 2 years after I had stopped answering her calls, Renata disappeared from my peripheral vision almost entirely. Until the morning I got a call from a number I didn't recognize and a voice on the other end said it was a correctional facility and I had a collect call from an inmate. I knew who it was before she said her name. I accepted the call. I'm not entirely sure why. There was a moment between the automated message and the connection where I could have pressed a button and declined and put the phone face down and gone on with my morning. I stood in my kitchen with coffee going cold on the counter and made a decision I hadn't planned to make. Her voice was different. Still recognizably Renata, but with something removed from it. The lightness she usually carried, that surface ease she deployed to manage situations and people, was gone. What was underneath it was smaller and more uncertain. She said my name. Then she said she was sorry for calling. Then she said she had no one else. I had heard versions of that last sentence from her before, in different contexts with different stakes. I recognized it as something she believed was true each time she said it. I also recognized that it had historically been deployed most often in situations where she had exhausted other options before reaching me. I was not the first call. I was the call she made when the others hadn't worked. She told me what had happened. Over the past 2 years, Renata had been involved with a man named Derek who ran a financial scheme that, as she described it, she had not fully understood when she got involved. Derek recruited people to open credit accounts and store cards using fabricated documentation, and then used those accounts to purchase merchandise that was resold for cash. Renata's role had been to open accounts and make purchases. She said she had done it because Derek told her it was a gray area. She said she hadn't understood it was fraud. I did not say what I was thinking about that explanation. She had been arrested 3 weeks earlier along with Derek and 2 other people. Derek was facing the most serious charges because the scheme was his construction and he had been running it for years before Renata joined. Renata was facing charges as a participant, not an organizer, but the charges were still significant. Her public defender had told her she was looking at a range of outcomes, depending on what she could demonstrate about her level of knowledge and involvement. She asked if I would help her find a private attorney. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I had once spread out a credit report with my name on $20,000 of debt she had created. I asked her several questions. I asked what Derek had told her specifically when she joined. I asked whether she had received payment and how much. I asked whether she had ever expressed doubt or attempted to stop. I asked how long she had been involved before the arrest. She answered most of them. Some answers were more complete than others. She was more forthcoming about Derek's role than her own, which I noted. When she finished talking, I told her I would call her back within a few days. She asked if that meant I was going to help. I told her it meant I was going to think about it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she understood that I had no reason to help her. She said she knew what she had done to me. She said she had thought about it many times over the past few years and understood that she had taken something from me that I had worked hard to build and damaged it for reasons that were ultimately about her own inability to face her problems honestly. That was the most accurate and undefensive thing I had ever heard her say about what she did. I told her I'd heard her. Then the call time ended. I sat with my coffee for a long time after. Felicity came over that evening because I'd texted her saying I needed to talk to someone. She sat on my couch and listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me what I was going to do. I told her I didn't know yet. She said she noticed I hadn't immediately said no, and she thought that was worth paying attention to. I called my mother the next morning. She already knew about the arrest. She had known for the 3 weeks Renata had been in custody and had been trying to figure out how to tell me. She sounded exhausted in the way that parents sound when a situation they cannot fix has been sitting on them for too long. She didn't ask me to help. She told me whatever I decided she would understand. My father got on the phone briefly. He said the same thing in fewer words. I called Constance O.B., my lawyer from the identity theft case, and asked if she handled criminal defense or could refer me to someone who did. She said criminal defense wasn't her area, but she knew a lawyer named Terrence who handled cases like Renata's and was thoughtful about how he assessed culpability in situations involving financial fraud. She said she would send him my number if I wanted her to. I said yes. Terrence called the following afternoon, and I explained the situation without framing. I gave him the facts as Renata had described them and my assessment of which parts she had likely softened. He asked good questions and was honest about the range of outcomes. He said a participant with no prior criminal record who cooperated fully with the investigation and demonstrated limited understanding of the full scope of the scheme had a reasonable path to a reduced outcome. He said the key variables were how truthful she was willing to be and how effectively she could demonstrate the distinction between her role and Derek's. He asked if I was looking to retain him on her behalf. I said I needed one more conversation before I decided anything. I needed to talk to Renata again. Not through a prison phone with a time limit and an automated voice cutting in. I needed to sit across from her and ask the questions I had not yet asked and hear the answers in her face as well as her words. I drove to the facility on a Saturday morning. The visiting room was bright in the way institutional spaces are bright, overhead fluorescent light with nowhere to hide in it. There were tables bolted to the floor and chairs on either side, and a low murmur of other conversations happening around us that provided a kind of privacy through noise. Renata came in and sat across from me. She looked tired. She looked chastened in a way that wasn't performed, which I noticed because I had seen her perform chastened many times over the years and knew the difference. This was something that had actually reached her. I told her I had contacted a lawyer named Terrence and that he believed she had a defensible path if she was willing to be fully honest about her involvement and cooperate with the investigation. She said she was willing. I told her that willing was a word she used easily, and I needed more than the word. I needed to understand what had actually happened, and I needed her to tell me without managing what she thought I could handle. What came out over the next hour was more complete than anything she had told me on the phone. Derek had recruited her at a point when she was financially desperate, which was a state she had created through her own spending and a series of bad decisions she had been making for years. He had framed it as simple and low risk, and she had accepted that framing because she needed money and because believing something was low risk when you need it to be is not the same as it actually being low risk. She had known it wasn't legitimate. Not the full scope of what Derek was running, but enough to know that what she was doing was wrong. She had kept going because she was afraid of what stopping would cost her with Derek, who was not a safe person to disappoint. And because the money was solving problems she didn't know how to solve any other way. I listened to all of it. Then I asked the question I had been carrying for 3 years. I asked why she had chosen me specifically. Of all the people whose information she could have used, why had she used mine? She was quiet for a long time. She said she had chosen me because she knew my information. She had my social security number from a document she'd seen years earlier when I had asked her to help me with some paperwork while I was visiting home. She had kept it. She said she chose me because she knew I was responsible and my credit was clean, and she thought the accounts would get approved. She said she knew it was wrong when she did it. She said she told herself I was the kind of person who would be fine, that I would figure it out, that I would recover. She said she had used my competence as permission to take from me. She said that was the most honest answer she had. I sat with that for a moment. There was something in that answer that was terrible and also in its honesty the most useful thing she had ever said to me. She had seen my capability and used it as an excuse. She had decided I could absorb the cost because I was strong enough to rebuild. She had made me pay for her choices because she believed I was capable of surviving it. She had been right that I was capable of surviving it. She had been wrong that capability made it acceptable. I told her I was going to retain Terrence on her behalf. I told her I was doing it for my parents, who were exhausted and frightened and did not deserve to watch their older daughter face this without any real defense. I told her I was doing it because I had learned in the years since she took from me that the kind of person I wanted to be did not abandon people in crisis, even when those people had abandoned me. I told her I was not doing it because what she did was forgivable yet, or because I expected anything from her in return. I told her what I expected was that she would be completely honest with Terrence and the investigators. That she would not manage the story or soften the edges to protect herself at the expense of accuracy. That she would cooperate fully and face what she had done clearly. She said she understood. She said thank you in a voice that didn't have anything else behind it. No calculation. No management. Just 2 words that meant what they said. Terrence took the case. He spent several weeks working with Renata on the full account of her involvement. She cooperated with the investigation and provided information about Derek's operation that was useful to the prosecutors. Derek, it turned out, had been running versions of this scheme for nearly a decade under different names and with different participants. Renata was one of several people he had recruited with the same pattern of framing the activity as low risk and building enough personal dependence to keep participants from leaving. Her cooperation, combined with evidence of Derek's manipulation and her limited prior record, resulted in a plea arrangement that avoided prison and included probation, restitution, and mandatory financial counseling. I did not go to court for any of it. Terrence handled everything and kept me informed with brief updates that I read and filed. Felicity asked me how I was feeling about the outcome, and I told her I felt finished with it in a way I hadn't felt before. She asked if I meant I had forgiven Renata. I told her finished and forgiven were different things. My parents called me together the day after the plea was entered. My mother thanked me in a voice that sounded like she had been holding something very heavy and had finally set it down. My father said very little, which was his way of saying a great deal. Renata sent me a letter 2 weeks after the case concluded. A handwritten letter, which surprised me. 4 pages in her handwriting. She did not make excuses. She described what she had understood about what she had done in specific terms, without softening. She described the damage she had caused me and named each account and each amount, and what she understood those amounts had cost me beyond just money. She described finding my credit report in a search she had done years after the dispute resolved and seeing my score recovered and feeling something she called relief and shame at the same time. She said she was going to repay the full amount. Not because a court required her to repay me specifically, but because she wanted to. She attached a written payment plan that Arthur, had he reviewed it, would have called realistic. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer. I didn't respond immediately. I needed to sit with it for a while before I knew what I wanted to say back. Felicity asked me at lunch a few weeks later how things stood with Renata. I told her about the letter. She asked if I was going to write back. I said probably. Eventually. She said she thought that was the right answer. Not rushing, not closing. Just moving at the pace that was actually honest instead of the pace that looked good. I drove home that afternoon and thought about all of it. The credit card bill in the white envelope. The $4,300 that became $20,000 when I pulled the full report. Constance and the 8 months of disputes. Arthur telling me behind is not the same as out of reach. The car I had driven off a lot when my credit score hit the right number. The promotion and the savings account and the quiet apartment I had built into something that was entirely mine. And Renata's handwriting across 4 pages, naming the exact amounts she had taken. Capability was not permission. Surviving something was not the same as it being okay. But the version of me that had survived it and built past it was not a version that needed to stay angry forever. I picked up a pen. I started writing back.